He was just a 33-year-old bushman, then World War I turned him into a legend. In 1914, Harry Murray was cutting railway sleepers in the forests of Western Australia. He had no idea that within 42 months, he would rise from private soldier to lieutenant colonel, earn 6 decorations, and become one of Australia's greatest fighting officers. From Gallipoli to the Western Front, he would lead men through machine gun fire, brutal counterattacks, and impossible battles, until one of the highest honours in the British Empire was pinned to his chest. Before we reveal how an ordinary timber cutter became a Victoria Cross hero, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because this is the incredible story of Harry Murray.
A man is cutting railway sleepers in a forest in Western Australia. The saw is heavy. The wood is karri, which is one of the hardest timbers on earth. It blunts blades, breaks handles, and eats up the days of a man who works it. The trees are enormous. Some of them are 200 feet high. Their trunks are pale as old bone. Their bark comes away in strips the color of dried blood. The man swings again. He is 33 years old, which is old to start a war. His name will one day be known in every parish hall and return soldiers' club in the country. On this morning, it is known to the men in the next clearing and to nobody else. He does not know that in 42 months, he will go from private soldier to lieutenant colonel. He does not know that he will be decorated 6 times. He does not know that his country's official historian, a small, quiet man with a notebook, will one day write that, of all the fighting officers Australia sent to that war, this one was the finest. He does not know any of it. He is cutting sleepers in the timber trade on the wages of a piecework man in a forest west of a town called Manjimup in the September of 1914. Nobody who watched him cut timber saw any of that coming. Not the men working alongside him, not the ganger who paid him, not the boss who counted the sleepers stacked at the siding, and certainly not the man himself. He was just a bushman with a saw. He was very good at his job, and soon he would be very good at a different one. His name was Henry William Murray. Everyone called him Harry. He had been born on the 1st of December, 1880, at a little place near Evandale in northern Tasmania. His father ran a farm. Harry left school young to help work it. As a boy, he liked horses and rifles and the militia parades that came through the district. He joined a volunteer artillery unit in Launceston at the age of 21 and served in it for 6 years, learning how a gun crew works, how orders travel, how discipline holds a body of men steady when they would rather run. Then he moved to Western Australia, which was where a young man went in those years to find money. He carried mail on the gold fields. He worked as an armed escort for a mining company on the routes where bandits still robbed the coaches. And by 1914, he was employing timber cutters for the railways in the southwest, in the karri country, where the great pale trees stood 200 feet high, and the men who felled them were paid by the piece. Then in August of that year, the newspapers began printing telegrams from Europe. There had been an assassination in a place called Sarajevo. There had been ultimatums between capitals nobody in the karri country had ever visited. There had been a declaration of war. Australia, as part of the British Empire, was in it too. The recruiting offices opened in Perth and Fremantle and Bunbury and the country towns beyond. Young men came in from the sheep stations and the wheat farms and the gold fields. Older men came in as well, though not so many. There was a general assumption in those first weeks that the whole thing would be settled by Christmas. Harry Murray was not, on any reading, a young man. He was 33. He had a job. He had a life. He had no reason at all to go. And on the 30th of September, 1914, Harry Murray walked into a recruiting office in Perth and put his name down as a private soldier. They offered him a commission on the spot. His record made it obvious. 6 years in the militia, experience of command, steady in himself, plainly capable. The recruiting officer expected him to accept. Harry Murray declined. He wanted, he said, to go as a private. He wanted to learn the war from the bottom up. He wanted to see it from the ranks before he tried to lead men through it. It was the first of many decisions he would make that his commanding officers would find strange and eventually learn to trust. He was posted to A Company of the newly formed 16th Battalion. He was sent to a place called Black Boy Hill, on the outskirts of Perth, to train. There, they put him on the machine guns. The machine gun crew of the 16th Battalion had 2 men on each weapon. The number 1 gunner sat behind the sights and fired. The number 2 fed the belts of ammunition through the mechanism and watched the flank. The number 1 on Harry Murray's gun was another West Australian, a big steady man named Percy Black, who had been a miner and a horseman, and who did not know how to be afraid. Murray was the number 2. The 2 of them became inseparable. They would fight the war side by side until Bullecourt in the spring of 1917 took Percy Black away. The 16th Battalion sailed from Melbourne 2 days before Christmas. It reached Egypt in early February. It trained through the desert winter in the sand outside Cairo for something the men were not told about, though the rumors ran up and down the ranks. There was talk of a landing somewhere. There was talk of the Turks. There was talk of a place on the Dardanelles. In April, the brigade was moved to a Greek island called Mudros to complete its preparation. And then, on the 25th of April, 1915, the 16th Battalion landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in the second wave, 3/4 of an hour after the leading brigade had gone ashore in the dark. The place where they came ashore is now called Anzac Cove. On that first afternoon, the 16th Battalion pushed inland and up onto a ridge, and Harry Murray and Percy Black set their machine gun down on the rear slope of a piece of ground that would be known ever after as Pope's Hill. They fired the gun through the afternoon and into the night. They fired it while men died on either side of them. The next day they were still there, sniping across the gullies at the Turkish soldiers on the ridge opposite. On the third day, when the Turks counterattacked and the Australian line shook and threatened to break, the 2 of them stayed on the gun and kept it firing. Both were wounded. Neither would leave. Charles Bean, the official historian, watching that sector, wrote later that the 16th Battalion machine guns were in charge of men of no ordinary determination. It was the first thing any one official ever said about Harry Murray. It would not be the last. Through May of 1915, the fighting on that ridge went on almost without pause. The Turks were dug in on the higher ground above them. The Australians clung to the slopes below. Every night patrols went out. Every day the shelling came down. And the machine gunners of the 4th Brigade, of whom Murray and Percy Black were now the most experienced pair, stayed on their guns through it all, moving the weapon from one shallow pit to another as the ground was chewed up around them, feeding belts, changing barrels, ranging on the enemy trenches at first light, dropping back into the pit and sleeping for an hour, and then doing it all over again. Murray was promoted Lance Corporal on the 13th. He was wounded again at the end of the month, badly enough this time to be evacuated. They put him on a hospital ship. The plan was to send him home. He got as far as Alexandria, then walked off the ship at the wharf, found a transport going the other way, and put himself back on Gallipoli by the 3rd of July. The Australian Army did not, in those days, always know where all its men were. It did not, for the moment, know quite what to make of a wounded private who had refused to be sent home. What it did was give him a medal. On the 29th of October, 1915, it was announced that Lance Corporal Henry William Murray of the 16th Battalion had been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions between the 9th and 31st of May. The citation praised his exceptional courage, energy, and skill on the machine gun. It said he had, in the words of the recommending officer, done everything that a machine gunner could do, and then done it again. It was the first decoration. There would be 5 more. Then, on the 8th of August, in the great and terrible attack on Hill 971, the machine gunners of the 4th Brigade covered the withdrawal. Charles Bean would afterwards describe those machine gunners as possibly the finest unit in the Australian Imperial Force. Murray was wounded again, more seriously this time. When he came back to duty, 5 days later, the Army had come to a decision about him. On the 13th of August, 1915, he was made a sergeant, and on the same day he was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant, and on the same day he was transferred out of the 16th Battalion and posted to the 13th. 3 ranks in a single day, from Lance Corporal to Junior Officer, in one signature on one piece of paper. He was still short of his 35th birthday. The war was less than a year old, and the man cutting sleepers in the Karri forest was now a company officer in an infantry battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. Gallipoli ended in a withdrawal in December of that year. The 13th Battalion went back to Egypt. They reorganized. They took on new drafts. Murray was promoted lieutenant on the 20th of January, 1916. He was promoted captain on the 1st of March. That was 6 weeks later. On the 1st of June, the 13th Battalion sailed for France, and in the middle of July, they moved up into the trenches of the Western Front, where a different war was being fought at a different scale, and where the rate at which Australia was losing its infantry was about to change every rule any of them thought they knew. Their first great test came at a place called Mouquet Farm, on the outskirts of a village called Pozières, on the ground that the Somme battle had been chewing over since the 1st of July. It was a farm in name only. The buildings had gone, the cellars remained, and underneath the cellars, a warren of German dugouts and machine gun pits and tunnels ran back into the rising ground. The Australians had already been fed into that ground twice, at appalling cost, when the 13th Battalion's turn came. Pozières and its neighbouring ridge had swallowed 23,000 Australian casualties in a matter of weeks. Every man in the 13th Battalion knew, going up, that the ground had a reputation. On the 14th and 15th of August, 1916, they attacked it. Harry Murray commanded a company.
He was just a 33-year-old bushman. Then World War I turned him into a legend. In 1914, Harry Murray was cutting railway sleepers in the forests of Western Australia. He had no idea that within 42 months, he would rise from private soldier to lieutenant colonel, earn 6 decorations, and become one of Australia's greatest fighting officers. From Gallipoli to the Western Front, he would lead men through machine gun fire, brutal counterattacks, and impossible battles, until one of the highest honours in the British Empire was pinned to his chest. Before we reveal how an ordinary timber cutter became a Victoria Cross hero, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because this is the incredible story of Harry Murray.
He was wounded early. He kept going. He was wounded again. He kept going. When his company commander was killed, he took over the company. When a German counterattack came in, he beat it off. When a second came in, he beat that off too. When a third came in, and a fourth, he was still on his feet. When an enemy bullet struck the equipment of one of his men and set the man's ammunition pouches beginning to smoulder and explode, Murray, at very great risk to himself, tore the burning webbing off the man's body with his hands before the whole belt of ammunition on the man's chest could go up. He held the ground. In the morning, what was left of his company was still on the position. When his commanding officer wrote the recommendation for his Distinguished Service Order, he noted, dryly, that, although twice wounded, Captain Murray had commanded his company with the greatest courage and initiative, and had beaten off 4 separate enemy counterattacks, that was the second decoration. He was 24 hours short of 36 years old, and he was, according to those who watched him work at Mouquet Farm, only beginning to hit his stride. His wounds from Mouquet Farm kept him out of the line until October. He was mentioned in dispatches on the 4th of January, 1917, for a series of trench raids and reconnaissance patrols he had led through November and December. And then his battalion was ordered up onto the frozen ground east of the Somme, to a shattered village called Bullecourt, to a section of German trench that ran through the snow on a low ridge, and that the British staff maps referred to as Stormy Trench. The night before the attack, Harry Murray wrote later that he could see the shape of it clearly. There was a moon. There was snow on the ground, and the snow held the moonlight so that the whole battlefield seemed to glow from underneath, a pale, ghostly light that made the wire look like drawing on paper. He said he was cursed with a vivid imagination. He said that before every action he went through it beforehand, in his mind. Blood, brains, limbs, all of it spattered on him, and himself dead a dozen ways. He said he made himself see it in advance, so that when the real thing came, it would be no worse than what he had already lived through in his head. He said the dominating factor was curiosity. He wanted to know how he would behave. He wanted to see whether the man he thought he was would hold up. It is not the kind of thing a reckless man says. It is the kind of thing a thinking man says. It is the sort of quiet, careful, private, self-examining sentence you would expect to find in a diary and not in the recollections of a Victoria Cross winner. And it is, of all the things anybody ever wrote about Harry Murray, the single most useful line for understanding what he actually was. On the moonlit ground at Bullecourt, he was about to find out one more time. The attack went in at 10 minutes past 10 on the night of the 4th of February, 1917. Captain Murray commanded the right flank company of the 13th Battalion, which the recommendation for his decoration later noted was the most dangerous position on the front. He had spent the previous days walking the ground in front of his line, alone, in the dark, memorizing every fold and shell hole between his trench and the German wire. He had briefed his platoon commanders on what he had seen. He had briefed his section leaders. He had briefed his stretcher parties on where to bring the wounded back, and then he waited for the moon to come up over the snow. When the moon came up, he led his men out of their trench, across the ground he had walked in the dark, under a barrage that lifted just ahead of them, and into the German position. The trench was captured in the first rush, and then began what the recommendation would call the severest fighting in the history of the battalion. 3 great counterattacks came in that night. One of them was in fact 5 separate bombing attacks in quick succession, coming down the trench system from the German flank. The enemy grenadiers working their way along the traverses, one bay at a time, and Murray's men fighting them back grenade for grenade in a system of turning corners in the moonlight where a man could hear the enemy breathing before he saw him. Through the hours of darkness, the German gunners poured heavy shell fire onto the sector Murray's company held. 4.2-inch shells, 5.9-inch shells, shrapnel bursting overhead, high explosive coming down. The company had gone in at a strength of 140 men. Through the night that strength dwindled. 100, 90, 70, 60. And at one moment, when the German bombers came very close and the line gave way for a short distance under sheer weight of fire, it was Harry Murray who held it together. He rallied the men where they were falling back. He led bayonet charges to clear the trench sections the enemy had entered. He led bombing parties down the traverses to seize the ground back. Between the actions, he carried wounded men back through the shelled ground to places where they could be treated. He was seen by his men in one place and a minute later by his men in another, and the accounts from that night have the odd quality of a man in half a dozen places at once, cheering, ordering, hoisting the wounded onto his shoulders, dropping into a bay to help a Lewis gunner clear a jam, and then moving on. In the morning, he was still there. Fewer than 50 of his 140 were still on their feet, but the trench was still his. The Germans, whoever remained of the 6 or 7 separate parties they had sent to take it back, had had enough. They abandoned the ground on their side. Murray's company had held. The recommendation for his Victoria Cross, which the London Gazette printed a month later, said that he was ubiquitous. That was the word they used, ubiquitous. Cheering his men, heading bombing parties, leading bayonet charges, or carrying wounded from the dangerously shelled areas, with unequaled bravery. His company, the citation ended, would follow him anywhere and die for him to a man. That was the 3rd decoration. He was 36 years old. He was still a captain. 9 weeks later, at a village called Bullecourt, on the 11th of April, 1917, his battalion was one of 7 from the 4th Australian Division, sent to attack the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was the strongest defensive position on the Western Front. The Germans had spent the winter perfecting it. It ran in belts of wire and concrete strongpoints and interlocking trenches back into the countryside for miles. The attack that had been planned to break it at Bullecourt was, on any sober reading, a very bad one. There was to be no preliminary bombardment, because the staff wanted surprise. There were to be tanks in support, which was still a new weapon, and which nobody in the Australian infantry entirely trusted. The tanks, when the moment came, mostly failed to move at all, and the ones that did move mostly broke down before they reached the wire. The attack went in at 4:30 in the morning, in the dark, without artillery support, into uncut wire against machine guns that had been waiting all night. Murray's company was on the left. They had 1,100 yards of open ground to cross, under machine gun fire, in the freezing dawn. He led them across it, shouting, So the men who came back would remember, "Come on, men, the 16th are getting hell over on the flank," and it was time to go and help them. He said it because the 16th was his old battalion. He said it because it worked. 3/4 of his company were killed or wounded before they reached the second objective. He was one of the ones still standing when they got there. He held the section of German trench they had seized until 7 in the morning, when the ammunition began to run out and the position could not be held any longer without support that was not coming. He got the survivors out. His commanding officer wrote the recommendation for the Second Distinguished Service Order, which is called the Bar. He is not only brave and daring, the recommendation said, but a skillful soldier possessing tactical instinct of the highest order. That was the 4th decoration. Percy Black, the man who had been the #1 on Murray's machine gun since Black Boy Hill Camp, who had fought beside him all the way through Gallipoli, who had been his closest friend in the army, was killed at Bullecourt, leading his own company forward through the wire. When somebody afterwards asked Murray what he thought of the plan of attack at Bullecourt, he is said to have replied, only that a whole generation of good men had been thrown away in it for nothing. He did not, in the letters that survive, speak of Percy Black at all. He went back to work. The rungs of the ladder from that point on came very quickly. On the 2nd of June, 1917, he stood in Hyde Park in London on a grey English summer morning, and King George V pinned the Victoria Cross onto his chest and pinned the Distinguished Service Order and the bar to it, together with the cross. There is no photograph of the King's face, only his hands. The story is that he asked Captain Murray a question in the polite way that kings do, and that Captain Murray answered in 6 words and looked at the ground. 6 weeks later, on the 12th of July, he was promoted major. On the 4th of November, he was given temporary command of the 13th Battalion in the absence of its commanding officer. He was, by then, one of the most experienced infantry officers the Australian Corps possessed. In March of 1918, he was posted out of the infantry altogether and given command of the 4th Machine Gun Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force, a specialist unit of just under 1,000 men whose Vickers guns were the concentrated firepower of a whole Australian division. It was, in its way, a return to first principles. He had begun the war as a machine gunner on Pope's Hill in the spring of 1915. He was ending it as the commanding officer of a battalion of machine guns on the Somme in the autumn of 1918. On the 24th of May, 1918, he was promoted lieutenant colonel. That was 3.5 years, almost to the day, from the morning in Perth when he had put his name down as a private soldier. He was 37 years old. Through the last 100 days of the war, the 4th Machine Gun Battalion was in almost every major action the Australian Corps fought. Hamel, in July, where the Australians and a company of Americans took a village in 93 minutes. Amiens, on the 8th of August, the Black Day of the German Army, when the whole line went forward, Mont Saint-Quentin, and Péronne, at the end of that month, where the Australians did what the British staff had said could not be done. And through September and October, when the American Second Corps was thrown into the assault on the main Hindenburg Line at a place called Bellenglise, Harry Murray was seconded to them as their liaison machine gun officer. The Americans were new to that kind of fighting. They had energy and they had numbers. What they did not yet have was the professional knowledge that 4 years of trench warfare had beaten into the Australians. Murray was sent across to give it to them. He organized the machine gun support. He walked the ground with their commanders. He advised on the timing and the placement and the ranging of the guns. He explained how a barrage of massed Vickers guns, firing indirect, could put a curtain of bullets over the head of the attacking infantry and keep the enemy in their dugouts until the moment of the assault. He walked the ground before dawn. He worked out fields of fire. He wrote out orders in his careful longhand and passed them to the American liaison officers, who found him, according to their own accounts, calm and courteous and quietly terrifying in his mastery of a business they were only beginning to learn. When the position broke and the Hindenburg Line was penetrated at last, the citation that was later written up for him said, plainly, that he had largely contributed to the successful work of the machine guns of that corps in the operations resulting in the breaking of the main Hindenburg Line near Bellenglise, and that he was recommended for high distinction. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre in October. He was appointed a Companion of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George the following May. He was mentioned in dispatches 4 times all told through the war: the Distinguished Conduct Medal from Gallipoli, the Distinguished Service Order from Mouquet Farm, the Victoria Cross from Stormy Trench, the Bar to the Distinguished Service Order from Bullecourt, the Croix de Guerre from the French, the Companionship of St. Michael and St. George from the British, 4 mentions in dispatches, 6 ribbons in a row on his tunic.
He was just a 33-year-old bushman. Then World War I turned him into a legend. In 1914, Harry Murray was cutting railway sleepers in the forests of Western Australia. He had no idea that within 42 months, he would rise from private soldier to lieutenant colonel, earn 6 decorations, and become one of Australia's greatest fighting officers. From Gallipoli to the Western Front, he would lead men through machine gun fire, brutal counterattacks, and impossible battles, until one of the highest honours in the British Empire was pinned to his chest. Before we reveal how an ordinary timber cutter became a Victoria Cross hero, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because this is the incredible story of Harry Murray.
And when the Australian Imperial Force went home in 1920, and Harry Murray's service formally ended on the 9th of March that year, he was, on any honest reckoning, the most highly decorated infantry soldier of the entire British Empire in the whole of the First World War. He never said so himself. He was not, in truth, the sort of man who would. Those who served under him remembered a quiet officer with a soft voice and steady eyes, a man who trained his companies hard and looked after them harder, a man who took long solitary walks over the ground in front of the line before an attack, because he wanted to know it in his bones and not just from a map, a man who at the end of a battle would count the men he had brought out and then go and be by himself for a while. There is a photograph of him, taken in a studio in London in the June of 1917, the week after he received the Victoria Cross from the King. He is wearing his captain's tunic. The 3 ribbons are on his left breast: the Cross, the Distinguished Service Order and Bar, and the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He is looking not at the camera, but slightly to one side of it. He does not look proud. He does not look pleased. He looks like a man who would rather be somewhere else. He looks like a man who has been asked to stand still for longer than is comfortable, so that people who are not at the trench can look at the ribbons. Charles Bean, watching him for 4 years, wrote him down in the end as the most distinguished fighting officer in the whole of the Australian Imperial Force. The historian of the 13th Battalion, remembering him afterwards, wrote something even more careful. Harry Murray, he said, was known in the ranks as Mad Harry, but there was considerable method in his madness. No officer took more care to avoid losing men, and no officer took greater personal risk in doing so. Ted Rule, another officer of the 13th who wrote a memoir of the war, said much the same thing. A soldier of the 4th Brigade, asked in old age what he remembered of Captain Murray, thought about it, and then said, only that his company would have followed him anywhere, which is very close to what the Victoria Cross citation had already said, on paper, in London, in the March of 1917. The nickname of Mad Harry followed him for the rest of his life. He did not, so far as anyone can tell, ever like it. It seemed to those who knew him after the war to describe someone he had never really been. The public wanted a reckless daredevil. What they had was a careful, thinking, professional soldier who trained his men to a standard higher than any battalion in the brigade, and who then, when the moment came, went in front of them. Charles Bean, watching him carefully across the campaigns of 1916 and 1917, wrote a longer verdict on him in one of his private notebooks. Murray, Bean said, was one of those men who always rose to the occasion, practical and careful, yet at the same time reckless of personal safety, one who always got the best out of their men. It is a description that has in it no space for the word mad. The madness, if it existed at all, was a public invention. The truth was more useful and less romantic. He was 36 when he took Stormy Trench. He had spent every hour of the 2 years before that learning his trade. He read manuals, he drilled his companies, he studied maps, he walked ground. He talked to the men who had come back from raids and made them describe what they had seen. He built his method piece by piece out of the experience of a war that was killing everybody around him. And then, When the moment came, he applied his method with a calm that people who did not know him mistook for something wilder. The legend that followed him was not built by him. It was built by other people, by the citations that were written up in the language of official commendation, by his commanding officers who saw him under fire, by Charles Bean with his notebook, by the soldiers of the 4th Brigade who remembered him in the reunions of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, by the historians who came after, when there was no one left alive from those trenches to correct them. He was assembled, in the end, out of other people's judgments. He is a legend the way most legends are made, not by the man, but by the men who saw him. After the war, he settled in Queensland. He bought a grazing property at a place called Mouquet. Then, in 1928, a larger one at Richmond, in the Western Downs country, where the grass runs for miles under a big empty sky. He married a second time, and he and his wife Ellen had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He read history. He kept sheep and cattle. He rode long distances on his own. He said very little about the war, and he wrote about it only rarely, in short, careful pieces for the service's journal Reveal, in the middle years of his life. When his children were small, he did not, according to what his son remembered later, talk about the medals. The medals were in a box in the house. Every once in a great while, if visitors asked, they would come out. Mostly they stayed in the box. His wife would tell people when they came to the property and wanted to meet the famous Mad Harry that they were about to be disappointed because the man they were going to meet was a quiet Queensland grazier who preferred talking about the weather. She was, of course, correct. And then in 1939, when the newspapers began printing telegrams from Europe again, and there had been another crisis, and another set of ultimatums, and another declaration of war, Harry Murray, aged 58 years and 7 months, put on a jacket and drove into Brisbane and told the Australian Army that he was available for service again. They took him. Of course they took him. The most decorated infantryman of the last war was not a man the Army was going to turn away. He was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the militia in July of 1939, given the shell of the 26th Battalion in North Queensland, and told to bring it back to strength. 2 years later, in October of 1941, when the war had come very close to Australia and the Japanese were moving south, he was mobilized for full-time service. The following year, when his battalion was rebadged into the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, he had to fill in the paperwork afresh. On the enlistment form for the 2nd AIF, he wrote his date of birth as the 1st of December, 1885. He was, of course, born in 1880. He had subtracted 5 years from himself with the stroke of a pen. He was 59 years old. He wanted, again, to go. His second in command in the 26th Battalion was a man named Edgar Towner, a Queensland grazier who had won his own Victoria Cross at Mont St. Quentin in 1918. 2 of the most decorated infantrymen the country had ever produced, sitting at the same table in a Queensland orderly room, running a training battalion of young men who had never yet seen a shot fired in anger. In a war that had come very near to their front door, neither of them, so far as the record shows, made anything of it. They were both by then middle-aged countrymen, professionally quiet, professionally careful, doing a job they had been asked to do. The battalion was based initially at Hughenden, with rifle companies scattered through the North Queensland country, at Julia Creek and Winton and Longreach. Murray drove long distances between them in the heat, wearing the same tunic he had worn on the Somme, with the ribbons on the breast, teaching young Queenslanders how to handle a rifle and how to move at night and how to look after their feet. There is a photograph of him from that period, taken outside a hut in the bush. He is standing straight. He is very lean. His face has the weathered look of a man who has spent 20 years on grazing country. And he is, unmistakably, the same man who was pinned by King George V in Hyde Park in the June of 1917, only older and thinner, and if anything, a little quieter. In August of 1942, General Sir Thomas Blamey, who commanded the whole of the Australian military effort, reviewed the role of unit commanders and formed a view about the 26th Battalion. Colonel Murray was, whatever his record and whatever his energy, close to 60 years of age. The 5 years he had scraped off himself on the enlistment form had not, in truth, deceived anybody who looked at him. The War of 1942 was going to be fought in the jungles of New Guinea and the Solomons by very young men against a very quick enemy. It was going to be fought in weather that broke old men. It was going to be fought at ranges where a company commander needed to be able to run. Blamey removed him from command. It was not, from the record, an unkind removal. It was a general looking at a roster and making a decision. There was, apparently, no argument from Murray. There was no letter of protest. He accepted the order and packed his kit and moved on. It is possible to imagine what it cost him. He had turned up at 60 for one more war, and the war had, politely, told him it did not need him after all. Harry Murray was reassigned to command the 23rd Queensland Regiment of the Volunteer Defence Corps, a home defence unit of older men based at Charters Towers, where he served for the next 18 months, drilling reservists and running exercises and preparing for an invasion of the Australian mainland that in the end did not come. On the 8th of February, 1944, with the tide of the Pacific War turning at last, he was formally retired from active duty and his name placed on the reserve of officers. He was 63 years old. He went home to the grazing country in the west of Queensland. He lived for another 22 years. He kept sheep. He watched, from a great distance, as the veterans of the Second War came home and settled and were absorbed into the country the way the veterans of the First War had been absorbed before them. In the wool boom of the Korean War, he did very well and travelled around Australia looking at other properties and other country. He went to London in 1956 for the centenary celebrations of the Victoria Cross and stood in a line of surviving holders of the decoration on a parade in the presence of the young Queen, and was photographed with his ribbons on his chest and his hair gone white, and said very little to the reporters who tried to talk to him. He did not talk much about what he had done. In old age, on a road near Miles in southern Queensland, on the 7th of January 1966, he was involved in a motor accident and died from his injuries. He was 85 years old. There is a statue of him now at Evandale, in Tasmania, near where he was born. It was unveiled in the February of 2006 by the Governor-General of Australia. The sculptor is a man named Peter Corlett. The statue shows Captain Murray at Stormy Trench on the night of the 4th of February 1917, with his revolver in his hand and his greatcoat open and his face turned slightly away, as if he is looking at something out beyond the frame that only he can see. Look at what he was: a timber cutter in a forest in Western Australia, a private soldier who declined a commission because he wanted to learn the war from the bottom, a machine gunner on a hill above a beach, a lance corporal with a Distinguished Conduct Medal, a junior officer commissioned overnight, a captain at Mouquet Farm with a Distinguished Service Order, a captain at Stormy Trench with a Victoria Cross, a major at Bullecourt with a bar to the Distinguished Service Order, a lieutenant colonel commanding a machine gun battalion at the age of 37, an advisor to the Americans at the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, a grazier for 20 years, and then, at 59, an old man leaning over a recruiting desk in Brisbane and telling a clerk with a straight face that he had been born 5 years later than he had, because he wanted to go one more time. He had rank, he had ribbon, he had the greatest collection of decorations any Australian infantryman ever wore. What he had, in the end, was something plainer than any of that. He had the habit of turning up. He turned up in the Karri forest. He turned up in the recruiting office in Perth. He turned up on Pope's Hill. He turned up at Mouquet Farm. He turned up at Stormy Trench in the moonlight, on the snow. He turned up at Bullecourt. He turned up at Bellenglise. He turned up, a quarter of a century later, at another recruiting desk with 5 years scraped off his age. He turned up. That is the legend, in the end. Not the medals, not the citations, not the notebook of Charles Bean, or the memoir of Ted Rule, or the statue at Evandale with a revolver in its hand. The legend is the man who kept turning up. Everything else, everything the empire pinned on him, and everything the historians wrote of him, and everything his soldiers remembered of him, is only the record of the places he turned up to. He was a very good sleeper cutter. He was a very good machine gunner. He was a very good company commander. He was a very good battalion commander. He was a very good grazier. He was, when he took the trouble to be, the finest fighting officer his country ever produced. But before any of that, and after all of it, he was a man who kept turning up. He turned up as a private when they offered him a commission. He turned up as a lance corporal when they offered him a ticket home. He turned up as a captain on the snow at Stormy Trench in the moonlight of a February night. He turned up as a lieutenant colonel on the ground the Americans were about to attack at Bellenglise. He turned up as a 59-year-old man at a recruiting desk in Brisbane, with 5 years scraped off his age, and on a moonlit night on the snow at Bullecourt in the February of 1917. He turned up one more time, and the Empire ran out of medals to give him.